and thank you for joining Antibiotics in the Environment, What Do We Know, and What is the Veterinary Role? Featuring Dr. Irene Bueno Padilla and Mr. Joshua Berman. My name is Nicole Cast, Continuing Education Program Manager for the Minnesota Veterinary Medical Association. The MVMA is pleased to be one of the hosts of the Antibiotic Stewardship in Veterinary Medicine webinar series, along with the Minnesota One Health Antibiotic Stewardship Collaborative. We are also working in partnership with the Minnesota Board of Animal Health, the Minnesota Department of Health, and the University of Minnesota's College of Veterinary Medicine. If you have any questions today, please type them in the Q&A area. With that said, I'd like to turn the session over to our moderator, Emma, and have her tell you a little bit about herself and introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Nicole, and welcome to the Antibiotic Stewardship in Veterinary Medicine webinar series. My name is Emma Leoff, and I am the new project manager for the Antibiotic Stewardship at the University of Minnesota College of Veterinary Medicine. And I am filling in today for Dr. Amanda Bedoin, Director of One Health Antibiotic Stewardship at the Minnesota Department of Health and Adjunct Assistant Professor at the University of Minnesota College of Veterinary Medicine. The Minnesota One Health Antibiotic Stewardship Collaborative is made up of folks just like you, professionals interested in leading our state's multidisciplinary approach to stewardship. The collaborative has joined forces with MVMA to bring you a terrific lineup of webinars over the past 5 months. The expectation to be good stewards of antibiotics is real and present. This webinar series is intended to provide background on the problem of antibiotic resistance, the solution of stewardship, and provide actionable information for all sectors of veterinary medicine. Today, we are joined by experts who will share information about 2 aspects of antimicrobial use that are often overlooked or incorrectly understood: antibiotic contamination of the natural environment and pharmaceutical disposal regulations. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Irene Bueno and Mr. Joshua Berman. Dr. Bueno is a veterinarian from Spain. She completed a clinical internship and residency in avian medicine and surgery at the University of Minnesota Raptor Center. Dr. Bueno has MPH and PhD degrees from the University of Minnesota and has conducted research on zoonotic risks to humans from wildlife trade and epidemiology of AMR in the environment. She is currently in an ecoepidemiology postdoctoral position at the University of Minnesota focused on AMR in the environment. And Mr. Joshua Berman has been working with hazardous materials and hazardous waste since 1993 and has been a hazardous waste inspector working with healthcare facilities and pharmaceutical wastes with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency since 2002. Thank you very much for presenting today, Dr. Bueno and Mr. Berman.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the kind introduction. I wanted to start by saying that I'm not really an expert on the chemistry of antibiotics, but my expertise, especially coming from my PhD, is more on the epidemiology of environmental antimicrobial resistance, or AMR, and specifically how we can design studies and advance the methodology to attribute what we find in the environment to specific point sources of anthropogenic origin. Today, I will give you a brief overview of what we know about antibiotics in the environment and a bit about AMR as well, and how antibiotics and AMR get into the environment, how we can study them, as well as things for us veterinarians to consider. So let's start. Let's see if I can advance the slide. Sorry, just one moment. I'm having problems to advance my slide. There we go. Sorry about that. So first of all, let's talk about why we care about all of this. And this is probably repetitive for many of you, but I just wanted to set the stage for what we talk about today. So antimicrobial resistance, or AMR, is one of the top public health threats in the 21st century. And here I just present you some numbers from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, that are a bit old now, from 2013, but they still make the point where they estimated that 2 million illnesses and about 23,000 deaths could be attributed to AMR every year in the United States alone. An important consideration when we talk about solving the AMR problem is the complexity of AMR. And as you can see in this already complex figure, it's just not only the human component, but we also need to consider food animals, companion animals, aquaculture, and all the waste that is generated from humans and animals. So all this waste from humans and animals is gonna end up one way or another into the environment. And this is why you can see here like rivers and streams, soil, sea and lakes, and wildlife that I circle in red, because this is what we will focus on today. So the importance of the environmental dimension of AMR has been actually acknowledged more and more in the last few years. And on one hand, it's been in the literature, reflecting in the literature how there has been more papers looking at this aspect of AMR, but also in national, local, and also international efforts, the environment has been increasingly considered and acknowledged. So at the national level, we had the Presidential Advisory Council on Combating Antibiotic-Resistant Bacteria, or PACCAR. Here I just provided a link where you can see some of the past meetings where among those meetings, they had an entire symposium dedicated to the environment. And terrific speakers went there and talked about different components of AMR in the environment. Again, at the local level, like for example in Minnesota, we had this One Health antibiotic stewardship where the environment is one of the important components that it's being studied. And then at the international level, it's been also in the last few years that the WHO, OIE, and the FAO have also considered AMR in the environment as one of the main components that need more study. And all of these initiatives, both at national and international level, actually are using a One Health approach because, as you can imagine, AMR is really a problem that connects humans, animals, and the environment. So what are the inputs or sources of antibiotics and AMR into the environment? So we have a variety of them, and the more we look, the more we find that there are inputs that put antibiotics in the environment. The normal or the more traditional ones that have been studied are the pharmaceutical manufacturing plants, but we also have human wastewater treatment plants, terrestrial agriculture, aquaculture, and actually others such as ethanol plants or probiotic manufacturing that can also contribute to the release of antibiotics and AMR into the environment. There are reports, as I mentioned earlier, an increasing number of them that have found AMR and antibiotic residues in different environments, from rivers, soil, lakes, and even wildlife. So this figure here in this slide really nicely depicts some of the pathways of how AMR and antibiotics might end up in the environment. So if you look at the red dots, these dots represent antibiotics, but they could also represent resistant bacteria moving from humans, animals, aquaculture, food animals, and crops into the environment, especially into the aquatic environment. But not only is this route, but also from the environment, these red dots can also go back to humans and animals through very complex pathways. In this other figure from this paper that was from 2003, we can also see schematically the routes by which antibiotics may reach the environment. So we have in the middle, we have the production of the drug and how it can maybe directly go into the environment through the waste, and even to landfills if the disposal of the antibiotics is not properly done. And then we can see medicine in humans, how antibiotics might go through sewage and wastewater treatment plants. And animals, kind of a similar process, but especially in livestock, we have manure, and manure might be used as fertilizer that ends up in the soil. And from these places, the waste might end up in surface water, groundwater, which may end up affecting humans and animals as well. So why and how do we get antibiotics into the environment? So we have seen in the figures before some of the pathways, but why when we take an antibiotic or when we give antibiotics to animals, they end up in the environment? So here there is just kind of a very brief explanation of why when we take an antibiotic or when we give antibiotics to animals, not all of the antibiotics is going to be metabolized or absorbed. So part of that antibiotic is going to be excreted as an active compound through the urine and feces. And there is a wide range, as you can see, from 10 to 80%, because it's going to depend on the antibiotic, on the compound, on the animal itself. So there is a variety of factors that have that range. But some studies like this one by Kummerer in 2003 actually reported a high percentage of antibiotics consumed in Germany that were excreted and changed. And then once in the environment, the antibiotics are going to persist more or less depending on different factors, depending on chemistry, soil type, and I mean, there is a variety of factors that can influence this persistence. Just as a couple of examples, there was a study by Braschi et al. That they looked experimentally at some antibiotics, and for instance, they saw that amoxicillin was easily degradable with a half-life than less 1 day in soil. On the other hand, another study by other researchers saw that tetracycline had a half-life of more than 500 days in soil. So you can see how the antibiotics really vary. And this, I don't want to complicate anybody with this table, but I put the reference down there in case anybody's interested. But there have been many studies looking at antibiotic residues in the environment, especially in the aquatic environment. And this table just represents some of these papers, but I just wanted to give you just a few examples today from some of the key environmental matrices where we find antibiotics. So one of the largest studies looking for chemicals in the environment was conducted by the USGS in the late 1990s, early 2000s, where they took water samples from streams and rivers throughout the US. So they examined different chemicals, and among them, in this graph, you can see some of the results. They found several classes of synthetic antimicrobials, like sulfonamides, and some that are naturally derived, like lincomycin. More recently, if we moved, so that was rivers and streams, and if we look at lakes, and locally here in Minnesota, there was some recent work done by some of our collaborators at the University of Minnesota, where they found different types of antibiotics in lake sediments in different lakes in Minnesota, actually in these 3 lakes that are represented in this figure. So in this figure, you can see that they look at these 3 different lakes that have different inputs coming into each one of these lakes. In the y-axis, they have the approximate year of the sediment core because they were able to age approximately the sediment cores. And in the x-axis, they have the concentration of antibiotics deposited into the water body. So then the symbols and colors represent different types of antibiotics. But in general, what they found is that they looked at different kinds of antibiotics with different influences from human waste and agricultural waste, and they concluded that most of the influence was coming from wastewater effluent in these lakes that they looked at. And they found a variety of persistence between the antibiotics. So this is just another example of how you can find different antibiotics accumulated in the sediment of the lakes, and again, to consider the different chemistry and the persistence of these in the environment. The aquaculture industry is actually obviously growing worldwide, and in many parts of the world, like China, antibiotics are widely used. And usually they are administered as medicated feed, as you can see in that picture. And some of this food will be eaten by the fish, but some may end up in the bottom of the ponds, especially when fish are sick and not so willing to eat. And that feed, along with the excrements and the waste from the fish, will accumulate in that sediment in the bottom of the ponds or the sea cages. So in this figure, this was just an example to show you one of the studies that have been done in aquaculture. This is a study in China where they sample different sites around different farms in the sea. And these bar graphs on the right show the concentration of antibiotics in both water samples and sediment samples. And just in short, they found concentration of sulfonamides and tetracyclines both in these both samples at different concentrations. And I provide the reference here in case you are interested again in the details. And antibiotics have also been found in wildlife. And just as an example, in this paper, researchers analyzed the plasma from Eurasian griffon vultures looking for quinolone antibiotics. And they compared the concentrations from the vultures that came from 2 different areas of Spain. As you can see in the map, those 2 areas that are represented by the black dot. So they actually detected quinolone residues in 65% of the vultures, and the vultures that came from areas with more intense farming, that is the area called Navarra on the map, were more exposed to carcasses with antibiotic residues than the other group of vultures. And the concentration really in plasma was really low for if we compare with other studies in the environment, but still finding antibiotic residues in vultures, because given that they are scavengers and kind of on top of the food chain, is a good indicator of the environmental contamination with these residues. So if we do environmental studies, we might find antibiotics residues in the environment, but why do we really care? So back to the problem of AMR, antibiotic residues can influence the selection for resistant bacteria in the environment, and they can also impact the environmental microbial communities. So there are different studies looking at the effects, although there is still a lot of knowledge gaps in this area, especially because of the complexity of the ecology of bacteria. But for example, this study by Kohn et al. From 2006, they saw that in their experiments that tetracycline had an effect in the soil microbial community over time, and there are other examples as well. Other things that might happen is that antibiotic residues, if there is a high concentration, they might accumulate in the environment and then end up in the groundwater and contaminate the water this way. So I've been talking about antibiotics because it's the topic today, but I just wanted to briefly mention with this slide that obviously it's not just antibiotic residues, but there have been a lot of studies looking at the AMR in the environment, and more in the recent years. And the more you look, the more you're going to find, especially with more advanced diagnostic tools. But one of the challenges actually when we are looking at AMR and antibiotics in the environment is how we study these systems to be able to really attribute what we find in the environment to specific inputs. And what we did is that our team conducted 2 systematic reviews to look at this very question. And I provided one of the references here again if you're interested in the details. But in order to study this question of attribution, what we came up with is that we really need to design studies that are longitudinal so that we can see changes over time. We need adequate comparison groups so that we consider the natural occurring AMR in the environment and antibiotics in the environment. And we need also to consider confounders, because if we are looking at a river and we only focus on one input coming into that river, we might miss some of the other inputs that might affect the outcome we are looking for. And this kind of goes to the data analysis and quantifying the outcomes to really, again, attribute these findings to specific inputs. And even though it sounds very obvious, but really collaborations among these different disciplines are critical to really advance in this field and to be able to establish mitigation strategies after all. So now, actually, our team in Minnesota are conducting a study, a project in Minnesota where the goal is to predict the antibiotic concentrations in the natural environment. And the goal here is to really merge these fields of epidemiology, ecology, and microbiology so that we can focus on establishing interventions in areas where we predict there are higher antibiotic concentrations in the environment. So this is a combination of modeling approach, and that modeling is informing field sampling that then with those results will validate the model that we are building. And of course, there are many challenges and knowledge gaps in this field. And not only the epidemiology side of things that we are trying to advance, but when we talk about antibiotics, there are many different chemicals, metabolites that they might even reverse into the original compound. There are metals and biocides that can influence also and affect AMR through co-selection. And then there are a variety of inputs coming into the environment, as you saw. And ultimately, really, what we are trying to get at with the environmental dimension of AMR and antibiotics is what is the risk to human, animal, and ecosystem health. So I know I went very briefly through all of this information, but really my take-home message here was that it's really important to think holistically about this problem. And when we consider antibiotics and AMR in the environment, think about this figure that I showed you earlier, where it's all interconnected, and as veterinarians, we actually have a role when we are prescribing, administering antibiotics. Think about the judicious use of antibiotics, and especially the message from today is that antibiotics are not completely metabolized by our patients or by ourselves. So this is important when we are considering the prescribing and also when we are disposing of the antibiotics. That is something that Josh will talk more in detail. So here is my email address if you have questions that cannot be answered today. And I think that's all I have.
Go ahead, Josh, and start whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. Sorry, my audio dropped out there for rather a while, and I wasn't sure what was going on. Thank you, everyone. My name is Joshua Berman. I'm an inspector at the Hazardous Waste Program with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and I'm kind of following up on previous presentation, very ably given, a topic that we feel is important, looking even more holistically than just at antibiotics, but at all pharmaceuticals. As many participants in this webinar are probably aware, there are some federal changes and therefore resulting state changes in the requirements and regulation of pharmaceutical wastes in Minnesota, and that applies to veterinarians and veterinary clinics as well as other healthcare providers. Nicole said previously, if people have questions, please send them through the Q&A. It's up to you, Nicole, how you want to handle that. I am very comfortable answering questions or stopping at any time. We're going to zip through quite a lot of material very quickly. That being said, I'm going to scroll extremely quickly. I apologize if that was a bit too fast for anybody, but the most important slide I have in my presentation is this one at the very end. My contact information is there. Absolutely contact me via email or voicemail. I am out quite a bit during the summer doing presentations and inspections, so unfortunately, commonly if you call me, you very usually in the summer will reach my voicemail, but send me an email or leave me a voicemail, follow up as quickly as I can, and I'll talk more about that in just a minute. I'm going to zip back to the beginning, so apologize. At the bottom of each of my slides, a place to go online for more information. This presentation will be available through the host, or you can email me directly for a copy of this presentation. I honestly don't expect anybody to remember anything I say verbally. I talk a lot, so at the bottom of each slide, a place to go for more information. Most of these are fact sheets from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, but there may be some other resources as well. Standard disclaimer, this is a very brief global view, the 10,000-foot view, as it were, of pharmaceutical waste requirements and how they're changing in Minnesota. We're going to hit the big items. There may be additional small things or we believe more minor things that are not covered during this presentation that may be applicable to either your practice or your facility. A little bit of review. I apologize, many of you, this is review, but giving a basis and a foundation for what we're going to talk about in a few minutes. What has to be assumed in Minnesota? Every regulated, and we'll come back to that term in just a second, every regulated pharmaceutical waste in Minnesota must be either assumed to be hazardous and managed accordingly, or evaluated as non-hazardous. Evaluation is a big scary term for some people, but it simply means reviewing a waste and determining whether it is in fact hazardous or non-hazardous based on documented objective knowledge or testing. Simple opinion is not sufficient. We have to have documented facts or other information. However, what waste sources, what wastes are regulated? In Minnesota, all commercially generated pharmaceutical wastes are regulated, from pharmacies, clinics, human health care, animal health care, both are regulated. However, household generated wastes are only regulated after they're collected. If they are disposed by individuals in the home, they are not subject to these requirements. They're very different. So for veterinarians, this includes your patients. What do they have to do at home? Essentially, what do they have to do at home is nothing. We have very strong recommendations or encouragements for what we would like people to do at home to help protect the environment and reduce antibiotic and other pharmaceutical contamination in the environment, but it's not required. Commercial facilities, healthcare practitioners are regulated. When we talk about commercial versus household, in the veterinary field, we don't run into this very much, but essentially residential care facilities are generally regulated as healthcare. If you are boarding patients at your facility or you're caring for patients in lieu of them being sent to their owners' homes, the waste from that treatment will be regulated even though the animals may belong to someone else. Controlled substances, our favorite topic. This is the first of several changes we're going to be talking about. As of now, in Minnesota, controlled substances may be exempt from hazardous waste requirements, that is the waste requirements of the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, or MPCA, if they're either evaluated as non-hazardous, and this has always existed as an option, or if you don't know whether they're hazardous or not, so you must assume they are hazardous, and they are not sewered, they're managed under DEA and board requirements. That means collected and stored under those requirements, and they're then destroyed by a DEA approved method. That approval does have to be in writing from the DEA, and they don't give those out easily. Most common question we get on the human side is fentanyl patches. I apologize, I'm not sure how prevalent that particular pharmaceutical is on the animal side at this point, but this is a new change, new allowance for controlled substances. Empty containers, also a new allowance, a change here. Instead of the standard hazardous waste empty container requirements, as of now in Minnesota, you may consider a stock or dispensing container exempt if it held or was designed to hold 10,000 tablets or less. Yes, that's a lot. Or 1 liter of liquids or gels. Again, that's a pretty large stock or dispensing container. And all the product, that is all the pharmaceutical, has been removed from that container by normal means. There is no additional rinsing or measurement necessary. This does include warfarin, which is the big bugaboo, because warfarin, along with nicotine, though we see that far less on the animal side, is what's called an acute hazardous waste and has previously imposed far more stringent rinsing or disposal requirements. As always, you may continue to meet the normal hazardous waste empty container standard, which again is more stringent for acute hazardous waste such as warfarin. Nicotine, not probably going to be any change on the veterinary side, since not aware of many animals that are given over-the-counter nicotine replacement therapies, but for your own personal knowledge or your interaction with the healthcare system on the human side, nicotine, FDA approved over-the-counter nicotine replacement therapies such as gums, lozenges, and patches are now exempt from hazardous waste requirements. Full regulation still applies to anything with a prescription, e-cigarettes, vaping liquids, and other personal use products. So for disposal, what can we do? What are you required to do to meet the hazardous waste requirements, and also to help prevent the release of pharmaceuticals, including antibiotics, into the environment? Veterinarians and veterinary clinics, if allowed under Board of Pharmacy and DEA requirements, may ship their wastes for reverse distribution or through the existing pharmaceutical reverse distribution system. You may manifest with a hazardous waste transporter, that is a hazardous waste disposal company that comes to your site, uses a manifest, which is a very specific nationwide federal standard form for tracking hazardous waste from the place where it is generated, i.e. a healthcare facility, to its final disposal site, a hazardous waste incinerator or hazardous waste landfill. Small new requirement, those pharmaceuticals must now use the waste code PHARMS on the manifest. If you're contracting with a waste transporter, they're almost always going to fill out that paperwork for you before they come to your site. Finally, you may treat pharmaceutical wastes on site using one of many commercially available on-site destruction products, then must still manifest as a hazardous waste. Use of these products does not render pharmaceuticals non-hazardous, nor allow them to be placed into the normal solid waste. They remain fully regulated hazardous wastes unless they've been evaluated as non-hazardous. Sewering, the biggest change in pharmaceutical waste management in Minnesota, is effective on August 21st, in just a little over a month. No unevaluated, that is pharmaceutical waste that have not been shown to be non-hazardous or that have been evaluated as federally regulated. Minnesota does regulate some more pharmaceuticals as hazardous waste than the federal government does. This applies to those that are federally regulated at this point. They may not be sewered for disposal after August 21st. Again, this applies to healthcare facilities, healthcare practitioners. It does not apply to individual households or citizens in their homes, whether for human pharmaceuticals or veterinary pharmaceuticals using with their domesticated animals. Pharmaceutical waste may still be sewered in Minnesota if they've been evaluated as non-hazardous. That is, the generator, the veterinarian or other healthcare facility has said, yes, I can show that these pharmaceuticals are non-hazardous, and many pharmaceuticals can be shown to be non-hazardous, or they've been evaluated as only lethal. That is a state-specific regulated pharmaceutical waste. Here in Minnesota, we regulate an additional category of pharmaceuticals as lethal hazardous wastes. However, they may only be sewered to a publicly owned treatment works, bit of alphabet soup there. That simply means a sewage treatment plant, not to a septic system. Pharmaceutical wastes from a healthcare provider or business may never be discharged to a septic system. And POTW, the sewage treatment plant, has been notified prior to the discharge, and any conditions they apply are complied with. Essentially, the law in Minnesota says because every sewage treatment plant is different, some plants are more sophisticated and more capable than others, and also there's interactions with different wastes, that is up to the sewage treatment plant operator to determine what they can safely accept and safely not accept. At this point, the state is not aware of any sewage treatment plants in Minnesota that are prohibiting discharge of non-hazardous pharmaceuticals or controlled substances. However, kind of put it on your radar in the back of your minds that may be coming down the pike. We are seeing more and more environmental contamination from discharge to the sewer. Sewage treatment plants were built and are designed and operated to very efficiently and effectively and safely treat urine, feces, and liquid infectious wastes. They were never intended nor designed to treat chemical wastes. and pharmaceuticals are nothing more or less than physiologically or psychologically active chemicals. They're just a subcategory of chemicals, and sewage treatment plants simply, for the most part, don't treat them. They simply pass them straight through into the rivers and lakes. This is also why households, though they are not subject to any of these requirements, are encouraged to not sewer pharmaceuticals. So let's talk about disposal options for households. Your clients, your patients, patients' owners will commonly ask what they can or what they should do with pharmaceutical wastes. The best recommendation of the state is to direct them to a pharmacy-controlled collection receptacle, either at a healthcare facility or at a pharmacy or law enforcement location. Sewering is allowed for households, but is strongly discouraged. However, for households that may be transport limited, in some areas of Minnesota, while every county in Minnesota has a collection receptacle for household pharmaceuticals within 20 to 30 miles, that's a long way to drive for many people, and especially your clients and patient owners who may be transport limited, they may not have that option. In that case, treating on site with one of the available products or using a mail-back option is very much allowed and maybe their next best option. The website at the bottom of the screen, and again, you'll have a copy of this presentation being made available to everybody, is a place to find the closest household pharmaceutical collection receptacle based on zip code. Just plug in a zip code and it'll pop up all the ones close to you. At this point, Minnesota has a little under 350 household pharmaceutical collection receptacles around the state, obviously concentrated fairly heavily in the metro area, but again, every county should have at least one within 20 or 30 miles. Coming down the pike, preview for everybody. At this point, effective in August, federally regulated and unevaluated, that means any pharmaceutical waste that somebody has not specifically looked at and said this is either non-hazardous or only state regulated, likely will be banned from sewering by healthcare providers probably by about 2022. We're uncertain of this time frame because the state administrative rulemaking process can be lengthy and unpredictable. At this point, its minimum time frame is probably going to be 2 to 3 years, and so that's why we're predicting 2022. Also, pharmaceutical waste containers starting in 2022 will be required to be secured either with key lock or by placement in staff-controlled areas where staff are always present and patient owners are never left unescorted. There are, again, some additional smaller changes. These are the biggest ones that are going to affect the vast majority of veterinarians and veterinary clinics in Minnesota. So, if this is new to you or you're thinking, not sure, how do I do this? Resources available to you. Strongly recommend use of the MPCA's Small Business Environmental Assistance Program. This is a free and confidential outreach program of the MPCA. It is a non-enforcement program. If you call them up and say, hi, I'm so-and-so and I've been doing this, they may tell you to stop. They may tell you that's incorrect, but they do not say pass your name or identification information onto enforcement staff. They are strictly compliance assistance branch. That's their only job. I receive emails and phone calls from them daily, and they usually go along the lines of, a caller has said X. And my response is, please tell the caller to stop immediately and instead do Y. I never find out who the caller is, and it's an option. That being said, again, my contact information, there are a very, very limited number of hazardous waste staff at the state and indeed even the metro county level. For those of you located in the 7-county Minneapolis-St. Paul metro area, who the counties are your primary hazardous waste regulators in that area. And we have depending on how you count them, somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 regulated facilities in Minnesota. Frankly, it is a far better use of my time if you call me or send me an email and ask a question, even if you say, well, I'm not sure if I've been doing this properly, or my staff hasn't been, or I just took over from somebody and previously we were doing this. I may be able to help you resolve the situation with a 5-minute phone call or a few minutes typing an email in response, versus literally spending many hours driving to your facility, performing inspections, driving back, spending many hours building enforcement cases, documenting all that, going through a very convoluted and complex, yet necessary, legal process to issue enforcement and then issuing enforcement. It's by far in my personal interest to assist you on the front end to make sure you're in compliance and help you into compliance if you're not sure what you could or should be doing, rather than take the enforcement the enforcement option. Working with many different industries in Minnesota, the healthcare industry, including veterinary care, are by far and away almost always wanting and very eager to be in compliance, just sometimes not sure exactly how to do that or what the requirements are. So that external motivator, typically not used in healthcare. We use those with other industries that understand what they should be doing but may choose not to be. I've talked pretty continuously for quite a while. I welcome questions. Again, my contact information is here. If you want to ask a question but don't want to share it with the group, drop me an email or call me immediately after this call. That'd be great. So thank you.
Thank you, Josh and Irene. Greatly appreciate your contributions to this presentation. As of right now, I don't have any questions, but we'll give people an opportunity to type them in. In the meantime, in case any of you are wondering, you will receive a link to complete an evaluation of this session. Please contribute to that evaluation, and also attached will be your CE certificate of attendance. I'm currently not getting any questions. Josh or Irene, do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I thank everybody. There will be additional both in-person and probably webinar presentations from the MPCA. We have received some feedback from people in the healthcare industry in Minnesota, including in the veterinary side, that they may not be always getting the same information from different regulatory and licensing agencies in the state. And my response, and this has come across the healthcare field, is that many of the changes that I just talked about in the last few minutes are new. They were just released on the federal level in February, and the MPCA, the state environmental regulatory agency, just determined how to implement them in Minnesota and how they have to be implemented in Minnesota in May. And there is an education process, just as we're having presentations like this here today. We're also reaching out and educating internally the staff of the Board of Veterinary Licensing. I apologize if I'm getting that name wrong. Board of Pharmacy, Board of Animal Health. All these agencies are also coming up to speed, and in the meantime, their own staff may not fully be cognizant of some of the ramifications. So if you have a surveyor at your site and they say something and you say, it's different than I thought I heard last week, please bring it up. We want to make absolutely sure that we address any of those inconsistencies and make sure that all the state agencies are speaking with the same voice.
Thank you, Josh. Irene, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Yes. I don't have anything in particular to add. I just wanted to, hopefully that this was helpful for people, and also my email is provided. So if there are any further questions or comments, please feel free to contact me. And thank you everybody for listening.
Yes, thank you everybody for taking time out of your busy day to join us. Have a great week.
Thank you.